Well, pleasure to be here today. It's a phenomenal platform and environment, and great to see all these faces tuned in around the world to engage with us on these topics. Can you bring up my slides, please? As Kathy mentioned, I am indeed the chair of the data and analytics workstream at Kraft, but I also have a consulting practice on the side where I take some of these strategic learnings and bring them to my clients as well. That's my company, Oak Health Partners. I'm going to spend some time going through some slides, a little bit of a different format than what Richard did, but hopefully we can get through some material, then have a bit of a discussion on what we've learned by seeing some of these results. So, as we've been talking about today, if I had to distill out the conversation so far, we can see that in many ways, the answers to these problems come from having a well-formed question, a understood and a properly powered data source, and then an analytical method that can bring together those two things to answer and drive an insight. And so, at the Kraft Precision Medicine program, we understand that questions can come from all sorts of places, but we recognize that organizations struggle to understand what are the data sources out there, especially in oncology, which is a very fast-moving space. And likewise, what are the analytical methodologies? Everything from deep learning and AI that people hear about to causal methodologies like GNS focuses on. And so we wanted to help understand what is that landscape of practitioners on the analytical methods that we can help point consumers to. So I'm going to first double click on the data sources discussion and show you some of the landscape work that we've done on that topic. So in 2016, the first real-world oncology data landscape was produced. I'll show it to you in bigger print so you don't have to squint your eyes to see those little bubbles. But this was work that was done over the course of 2016 by, I think, Sudhir and others at PwC. And this really focused on the longitudinality of data, the openness, the funding sources behind data, and looked at data sources of all types and sizes. And really, I think was extremely exciting because nobody had ever really pulled these data together before, had amassed the metadata on these data sources to be able to say what's out there and how is this space evolving and coming together. In 2018, we sought to update that landscape, but also to do it a little bit deeper and to look at who's actually integrating molecular, clinical, and outcome data in a really comprehensive fashion, because all three of those dimensions are essential to drawing real-world insights from these data. We also decided to not focus necessarily on the smaller data sets because some of those data sets just were underpowered to be useful in and of themselves, and really wanted to ask who are the major players and where are these major shifts occurring. So you can see here some of the landscape participants that we were able to engage with. This is the 2016 results, and the name archipelago I think definitely rings a bell here. This is a word that Paul and Kathy and I throw around often because there's a lot of little dots here. This is, we think of these as data silos in some sense. And we can see here that there are some large ones, but sadly, in the upper right-hand corner, which would represent those data sets that are both longitudinal and good long-term outcomes data on these participants, and shared in the public domain, there's very few dots up there, that upper right-hand quadrant. And so that shows that there's really a lack of publicly accessible data that the world can be consuming that would have the power to look at answering some of the questions like this answer fund question fundamentally. Now, if we can fast forward to the 2018 landscape, this is, again, focused on some of the larger data sets, so that's why some of the smaller dots are missing here. But you're seeing here, number one, there's more large data sets now. We have several data sets that have broached the 1 million patient sort of limit. Everybody from Flatiron and IQVIA to CODA and the PHAI Precision Health Group, right? And so we're seeing here these massive data sets that are aggregating and coming to bear in this space, and it's very exciting. We're also seeing stuff is generally being shifted up. In other words, more commercial models have been proven viable, that you can go now and either purchase these data sets or access them through subscriptions or academic relationships, and therefore have access to the data assets that are represented on the landscape, both of which are really nice. Now, we also asked a question to the landscape participants. We said, would you be willing and able to link your data to other data sources at the patient level if we provided, if you were asked to? And we were just interested to know how did people approach this? Did people kind of have the attitude of hoarding data, or were they open to aggregating and adding data together? And what we found nicely was actually that many organizations said that they were willing and open to providing a link at the patient level to other data sources. Now, the technicalities of how that gets worked out, and of course the contracting of how that gets worked out, is beyond the scope of what we pursued, but the attitude of openness seems to be evolving as well. And so, a few observations I just want to call out specifically on what we saw in these data. Number one was that we saw about a 25% median increase in the size of the data assets that were represented on the data asset. And like I said, a number of them have surpassed the 1 million patient threshold. Likewise, we're seeing that linking and sharing models seem to be winning, right? Nobody has the data in their own single institution, or very few organizations do. Likewise, if they do have enough patients, they typically don't have the molecular assets, or they don't have the long-term outcomes or the patient-reported outcomes that go along with that. And so what we can see here is that many organizations, and the most successful ones, have adopted models of collaboration with other sources of data that have enabled them to be successful. The third is that, like I mentioned before, organizations are increasingly willing to link and to share. And so we're seeing many models there where these organizations are entering into strategic partnerships with other data participants. But yet I still think that there are opportunities for advancing this frontier. And specifically, what I find to be interesting is that there's areas of high quality imaging sort of archives for radiomics and potentially digital pathology studies and imaging, right? Likewise, I think a very interesting challenge that we have now with these data sets is that they've become detached from the source. And oftentimes, when you do a model and you find out that you can predict 95% of patients having some outcome, and that's a tremendous result to have, you want to go back and say, well, who were the 5% I got wrong, and how do I engage with them and have an understanding about deeply why maybe we had them wrong? Is there a mistake in the actual data source that we have? Was there some peculiarity about their disease or some alternative treatment pathway that we didn't capture in the data set, but if we talked to that patient, we could understand? So obviously in a way that respects patients' privacy, but in a way that we can also recontact these patients, that's a frontier of this space that I think is extremely exciting and powerful if we can figure that out. So I want to sort of open up the discussion here for the participants and ask you any one of a handful of questions that have come to me, in a sense. The first is, what are your impressions of this space of real-world data? Krishna, not to single you out, I know, though, that this has been a space that you've been a pioneer of as an investor and as bringing these companies forth and helping to establish the models that can be successful here, right? I'm curious, do you think that the field has progressed as much as I'm pointing out to, or are we overestimating that, right? I mean, have we seen actual progress in these last few years? And then furthermore, what's it going to look like in the 24-month time period? What are we going to be seeing there? And then lastly, what are the frontiers and the most value to consumers that we can add from where we are today? Who wants to start? Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, this ties into an idea that really hasn't been brought up yet, and that's the application of engineering principles or quality improvement methodologies to data sources that have high heterogeneity. I think there's examples in medicine that have been very successful to answer important clinical questions, and the one that I use is the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which in many ways has the same issues that multiple myeloma has, which is it's a relatively rare condition. You have treatment centers that are scattered over the country, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, they invested in certification of CF centers with the requirement that they collect standardized data and that everybody had to share the data. And then they were able to measure outcomes that looked at the variation in care between the different centers. And so taking an outcome like colonization with Pseudomonas, which is a very important driver of morbidity, they were able to notice that there were some very good performers and some very poor performers in that data set that were aggregated. What they found was that the good performers segregated new diagnosed CF patients from the patients that had had the diagnosis for some time, and they were able to preserve that lack of colonization for a longer period of time.
Right.
And that the data that mine the ongoing real-world variability in practice is, I think, something that some of these groups are being able to leverage, but we've not done it so much when we're looking at it from the research questions that we were discussing earlier.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, this comes down to sharing in some extent, right? I mean, Orion has tried to do something I'd say is very similar to that, right? This is a group out of the Moffitt Cancer Center. They've aggregated, I think, over 15 organizations now that have all promised to have treatment and data collection protocols that are standardized, called the Total Cancer Care Protocol. And even so, with that infrastructure in place and with the coalition of data, they've had a challenge getting that whole big machinery to dance and to generate consistent data they can bring into these studies. And it's something that it's an ongoing effort for them. Krishna, I saw you had your hand up before.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd say, I think this has got to be one of the most exciting areas in healthcare. Partially because I think of the sorts of opportunities it enables in places like multiple myeloma, a variety of other cancers. But frankly, kind of across all indications. We kind of need this sort of real world data in order to ask the sort of questions. I think if you take the approach of figuring out some of the questions that researchers, drug developers want to have, I think you come to the realization you need this longitudinal data. It's always evolving, especially in places like cancer. The way the treatments look now are different than the way they looked before. To me, I feel like the world has changed. I think you have 21st century cures, which some people in the room here have helped move forward. You look at the work Lee has done from the payer side, and the impact it can have in that community. So I think this is a really exciting arena. And I think 24 months from now we're going to see a lot more exciting stuff coming out. I think we're now in a moment where certainly the pharma universe has very much seen the value here. I think at least in certain pockets, and I see that more. And to me, I think one of the areas I'm really excited about is the whole patient-reported outcome genre. As we start to think beyond what we can get from existing systems, we may not even really know yet exactly what phenotypic markers are going to be really important to help characterize and parse apart diseases. So I think those areas are also exciting, and in multiple myeloma, in other cancers, but also in other non-cancer indications.
Sure. Daryl, don't see your hand up much. We'd love to hear from you. Oh, you seem to be muted. Let's come back to you. You can unmute. Stuart, let's go to you.
Yeah, I think that's, when you look at where we're headed and what the driver here is, as we start to close the loop and get that data back to the physician at the point of care, it's going to stimulate the whole, they're more willing to get the data if at the end of the day you get the data back and can actually use it to help take care of your patients, while you're seeing them, not just siloed off in some research, only to be looked at, at some distant point in time. And,
right.
And that's coming. I think that we'll start to see the data being pulled out of EHRs, circle back, and then being given to physicians at times, and they can use it to say, well, my patient looks like this. How did other patients do when they got treated with that?
Yeah.
And I think that's coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Daryl, do you want to pitch in again, or did we lose the chance to talk to you? Oh, we're still not hearing you. Can you guys figure that out? Marty, do you have a comment on this? Oh, you're also having problems. All right. Sudhir.
Am I having problems too?
No, you're not. We hear you loud and clear. Go ahead.
All right. So, first off, just a thank you to you for sort of taking the baton and take this analysis to the next level. As a past consultant, it's always nice to see when your decks don't end up on the shelf. I do think perhaps you give a little bit too much credit to the progress in sharing. So certainly there's been a number of new collaborations in this space, but the way the space has evolved and what it's taken for a couple of the organizations that are coming out on top and really putting a dent in this problem, these aren't organizations with 10, 20, $50 million in funding. These are organizations with 100, 200, $500 million in funding that it really took to actually put a dent in the data aggregation of real-world evidence problem. And by its very nature, that deserves a little bit of ROI for those investors. And so the open sharing of all of this as it comes together, it's probably still a pretty big challenge when it comes to open sharing versus sharing with your collaborative partner.
Yeah.
just because of the sheer amount of efforts. I mean, anyone who's done this knows the tremendous amount of effort and tens of hundreds of people that needs to go into data abstraction to really do anything when it comes to extracting real world data from EMR.
Right.
So,
well, you bring up a really good point, and one that I think is, for those of us in the space can really understand. And Krishna, this is an interesting dynamic, right? The Flatiron $2 billion acquisition by Roche shows the value of these data sets. It also, there's value in the pipes, right? The connections to patients, to EMRs, and the system of pulling it out, cleaning it, and making those data useful. But what this does is every other data holder now says, my data are gold, and I need to make sure I'm getting close to my $2 billion worth of mine. And so there's always this question about, well, where's the value? Is the value in the data or in the pipes? Because a lot of people have data. Flatiron also built the pipes. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, is that the ability to seamlessly get data from a large community of physicians with patients being treated today, and with a short latency, being able to look at those data and make a decision about how treatments are being used and outcomes are changing. Because as we know, treatments are changing all the time, outcomes are changing all the time, standard of care is changing all the time. So if we have a high latency system with, let's say, slow pipes and slow progress through those pipes, we can't actually have the insights that can continually evolve care. Yeah, sure, exactly. Brad, a comment from you?
Aggregate large amounts of data and answer questions. Facebook seems to be able to do it fairly well. So if we look at the drivers, they really tend to have a big impact. So I think you're right that we look at the value and also who controls the value. If we look back at HIV, certainly the patient had a huge influence, and we saw some success on the standardization of an assay, a creation of cocktails or cocktails. Yeah. So perhaps if we empower the patient to have control of the value of their data, perhaps through Bitcoin, then perhaps that could be a driver to really push this forward.
Yeah, patients certainly want it, that's for sure. So let me continue if we can, because we have a lot more content to go through, and then we're going to have another opportunity for questions also and discussion after we go through the analytics aspect. So like I said at the beginning, in addition to landscaping up the data and the real-world data of oncology, we also have increasingly been finding stakeholders asking us, well, who are the analytics providers out there? How do they stack up against each other? What aspects are we able to sort of say are systematically being addressed by these analytics companies? And so we put a lot of effort over the past about 6 or 8 months in trying to survey this space, understand who's out there, and see what we can learn, right? Obviously, there's been a lot of headlines and pixels devoted to the advent of these analytics companies and the opportunities that AI can provide, not just in healthcare, but beyond healthcare. And that's, I think, made for a tremendous amount of excitement behind this space. At the same hand, though, there's been tremendous confusion and uncertainty, and to some point, actually downright disappointment about the ability of these technologies to deliver on healthcare today, right? I mean, for a long time now, healthcare has been, in some ways, a laughingstock of the AI space, because we've been so inept in trying to bring AI technology into the healthcare environment, right? So we can get into that, it's a whole nother conversation, but to say, in many ways, people want to understand what's out there and, where are the places that are most likely to be valuable as a consumer, as an investor, as somebody who's trying to help push this space ahead. So what we did is we recognized that there's a tremendous number of companies in this space. In fact, some really sophisticated people we'd speak to, when we told them that we found 65 companies that are in this space, they were actually downright surprised that we were able to find so many companies there, right? And so what's interesting is what we did is we asked, for all the different stakeholders, there's some fundamental questions they want to know. Who should I partner with? Who should I invest in? Should I buy the technology I need, or should I build it, right? What are the most mature technologies that maybe are going to end up in the clinic in the next 5 years? And how do I know which ones those are? And so we sought to answer some of these questions by providing some metrics around this space to look at how these companies stacked up. This is a list of the 48 companies we included in our final analysis. You can tell here they're sort of across the board. A lot of these companies are based in the US, but there are some European players as well. We had to remove companies that had 2 hallmarks. One is that they were too complex. So companies like a Flatiron or an IBM or an IQVIA while they have analytic capabilities, it's hard to judge from the outside how much those analytics capabilities are driving and delivering value today. Obviously, these companies are major players, and we don't want to suggest that they could be ignored, but they're just hard to put into our analysis. And likewise, there's many companies that are just emerging in this space, and there's just insufficient publicly available data on what they're doing, how they're doing it, and the progression that they're seeing in their platform. So several companies, about 17 or so, we had to remove from the analysis as well. What we notice is that there's essentially 3 different large buckets of preclinical, clinical, and clinical research and clinical care that these applications fall into, and specifically about 6 use cases within there, from drug discovery to biomarker and target ID, clinical trial access and clinical trial patient identification. Sorry, clinical trial analysis was the first one. And then lastly, population and value-based healthcare solutions, as well as clinical pathways and decision support. And so what we did an analysis on each of these buckets as well. And the method we used was we looked at to what extent we can see that companies are either accelerating or established. And we looked at the acceleration of a company by how much financing they received between April of 2017 and April of 2018, the percentage of job growth that they're experiencing, so how many headcounts are they adding, and then the percent of open positions at the time when we looked at them in the April period. So we asked fundamentally, are these companies looking for a much brighter trajectory in the 2018 to 2019 period? Likewise, in terms of establishment, we asked, well, how many publications or case studies have they put their name on and they can point to as successes? How many partners or customers are they speaking publicly about working with? And of course, how much financing has the investment community found to put into their effort and behind them? And obviously, with these 2 dimensions, and of course, who doesn't love a good 2x2? We're sitting here at Harvard Business School, right? We have here, in a sense, now we can look at companies as in regard to this 2x2, and you can see the upper right quadrant are these hot companies. And these are the companies that both have an established track record, but are also growing at a tremendously fast pace, and therefore represent companies that I think are in a really good position to build on what they've done so far and are showing that acceleration and momentum in the future. Now, I'll be the first to say this methodology, while it was something that Richard and I cooked up, I think, on a rainy March afternoon, it is limited, right? We're very US focused in what we do. We have limited accuracy with both large and small companies. We are able to quantify the companies as a whole, but not necessarily their specific capabilities, because that's even more granular than we can get into. This is also a trailing indicator. Already having the analysis end in April of 2018, we're limited by what we can conclude there. And lastly, this may fail to capture some of the breakthrough innovations that are occurring by these companies that are paradigm shifting or very different in what they're doing. So this is the way the 2x2 shows up when you actually look at the results. You can see here these companies fall nicely across the spectrum. We normalize everything by percentiles, so those middle lines represent the 50th percentiles. And you can see here, not surprisingly, that companies tend to scatter in the top left, which are the established companies that tend to be accelerating at a little bit of a slower pace, and the bottom right, which tend to be the companies that are small and growing fast and not necessarily established yet, but showing tremendous amounts of growth over the last year. The top right companies, though, I think are the ones of tremendous interest, and so what I'm going to do is go through each of the different use cases and highlight some of those companies and what they're doing. So the first is Wuxi Nextcode. I don't know if folks have heard of them. They're a big player in the CRO space and coming out of China. They actually have $240 million investment in the past year, and they're regarded as one of the most innovative companies in their space. Right? Likewise, Tempest. Tempest came from, I won't even try to say Eric's last name, but the founder of Groupon formulated and came up with Tempest. They in-licensed the ASCO CancerLink data asset, and now they've actually been putting tremendous amounts of analytics on top of that, and they just put Series B $80 million into their coffers, and I believe they've already even reached unicorn status in less than 2 or 3 years since founding. And they've announced over 40 partnerships, actually. Lastly is Recursion Pharma, which received a tremendous amount of funding and has several big pharma relationships that I think is also quite interesting. These are, of course, the companies in the biomarker and target discovery space. Another few to mention here, drug discovery. NewMedi is a company out in the Bay Area, actually. It's founded by the wife of Atul Butte, who's a famed professor out there as well. And these guys have tremendous numbers of partnerships with pharma companies, a whole bunch of publications, and they're also sort of emerging on the scene as a really interesting and hot player with regard to sort of analytics-based drug discovery technologies. FDA comes up as a company that's really hot in the space of clinical trial patient ID. Interestingly, they have what I would consider a pretty breakthrough technology. They're looking at analytics of the facial composition, the facial phenotype, as a means of understanding rare disease diagnoses. And then they can use this for bringing patients into clinical trials. These rare diagnoses are incredibly hard to diagnose, and therefore many times patients lose the opportunity to participate in trials because they're not well diagnosed. AI Cure is a company that's standing up in the clinical trial analysis space. And this is, again, a really interesting company that I think is doing some fantastic stuff. They have over 100 patents either pending or registered already. And they have experienced tremendous growth in the past year, growing about 50% in terms of headcount. Just a few more, and then we can go on. IASD is a company that is showing up here a lot as well in the clinical pathways and decision support systems. These guys are trying to use a new visualization technology to understand the variations in care and how those different variations can suggest improvements to pathways. And then lastly, I'll call out Coda, which stands up, and nice to have Stuart with us here from Coda, actually. They just raised $40 million, and they work closely with many leading institutions, including Memorial Sloan Kettering. And they've shown up also as a tremendously exciting population health and value-based care analytics company. So with this, and recognizing we only have a few minutes left, and I know I just flew through that material, we're going to send out the slides afterwards. But I want to ask, what are your general reactions? Did you see any companies here that we missed? And how do you think that this space is going to be evolving in the next 24 months? And so, let me open it up for questions. Who wants to either raise a question or make a comment? All right. Krishna, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great framework and I think a helpful way to look at all those companies. One of the things I think I think it came out in the discussion, and I think it was maybe a Clay Christensen framework from back in business school where he talked about how a lot of the profits end up aggregating around the hardest part of some pipeline. And I think the group identified data right now as maybe the hardest part of the pipeline. So I think we see a lot of analytics companies, but in the end, the data is still kind of prerequisite. To me, it feels like that's why healthcare always looks so behind in some of these areas. Is that you kind of go to some of the like kind of the larger analytics firms on the data on the data sciences side, and it's like you compare the sort of data we have in ad tech or social networking or something relative to clinical medicine. We're still kind of not yet, we don't have that first step, but once we do, I think all these really exciting things start to unlock. So to me, at least, I think it's a great framework. I think it's really good analysis on it. To me, as I look at it, all the value is really, at least today, in just getting to step one.
Right.
We're kind of just like, we're not yet at the point where we can really apply really all the exciting data sciences stuff to it. And that to me, it kind of speaks to a little bit to why there's not so many exits in certain categories there.
Yeah. No, I think those are very good points to be made. I kind of think of this as there's a first mile problem and a last mile problem. The first mile problem is getting the raw materials to feed into these algorithms and platforms, and that's the data typically. And the last mile is translating them into changes in clinical practice, right? And how do we impact clinical practice, or how do we go invest in a drug discovery or drug development program from a molecule that a computer built, right? And so all these things are translations coming out of them as well. But I guess a question for you, Krishna, sitting there on the investment side, if we are seeing progress on the data side, if there are now multiple viable models that have 1 million plus patients in the real world evidence space, at what point, how will you know that the tides have shifted and that the new crux of the problem is on the analytics side and not necessarily held up anymore by the data side?
To me, I feel like at least right now, analytics is not really the bottleneck. I think oftentimes if approaching some of these things from a domain which is not oriented around data, then it can sometimes seem like the more esoteric, more challenging part of it, because people talk about computational topology or recurrent neural networks, and folks often don't know what those are. But I don't think those are really the bottlenecks right now. In point of fact, many of those techniques are open source. I think that's the way a lot of the data sciences companies, certainly that's the way Google's approaching it. All the cool stuff they're developing, they're releasing out into the public. They're publishing almost all of it. And so, to me, I think the way that we know that we're there, is actually, I mean, it's when we start to really see cures or deep impact, in the diseases. So to me, that's all about developing the drug. That's non-trivial to do. That's really scary to data sciences people, to actually develop the drug, but it's, people do it. And to me, I think, the time when I feel like we'll see some significant shift in the industry is when somebody can say, well, in a similar case to like PCSK9, let's say, where there was some data-oriented approach to identifying an interesting target that was then actually, targeted. Obviously, payment issues on the other end of it. But when we see that sort of story carry through in cancer or some other areas, not once, not twice, probably a multitude of times, before people can say, well, all the value isn't in the drug, it's not even in the data. It's like it's now somewhere in the analysis and the array of interesting questions to be asked.
Interesting.
I think we see that in other areas.
Yeah.
But I don't think the world believes that that's the case today. I think that promise has been told before in healthcare.
People are skeptical.
Only to have not been shown true.
Right.
But I think that's what it'll take.
Yeah. Mark, let's go to you. You have a comment or a question?
Yeah, I do have a question. Mostly I'm just a dumb doc. I don't understand this space very well.
We forgive you.
But I wanted to tie something that Krishna had said together along with a question to one of the other participants, Lee Newcomer. To me, I parsed from Krishna's comments that a lot of the payoff in the space is actually the investment in a new drug or a new device or something of that nature. And so to some degree, I was a little bit surprised to see Regeneron not up on the matrix there. Of course, that's self-interested since we're partnering with them. But they also are dealing with the UK. So I think it's not completely self-interested. But to me, the thing that he alluded to that I think is relevant is a lot of this has to do with how do we improve the clinical care? Because it's all well and good to develop a new drug, but if we can't get it into the patient and use it in an effective way,
right.
It's not going to realize its value. And the care system itself is so inefficient that actually I think you could argue that if we didn't spend anything new in terms of new drug development and just improved the delivery of the methods of the medicines we currently have, we'd probably have a bigger impact in health outcomes. And that's what a business like Optum that Lee Newcomer's involved with is really engaged with. And so I'm really curious to hear his perspective related to this.
Yeah. I'm not sure we have Lee here anymore. I just see his picture. So either he's having a technical problem or he had to depart. So I wish he was here to answer that. That would be a fantastic conversation I'd love to see here.
I might just say both things can be true, right? Like both, it can be the case that both, definitive cures or impact to diseases through drug discovery, can create, I think, huge amounts of value in the system. And it can also be the case, as I think it is, that there's huge amounts of waste in the system. It's very challenging to get innovation to patients. It's challenging to figure out, how to pay for any of that. And both to me, I think both things are true. That's why it's complicated. And then we can ask the question of like, if you had to stack rank and pick one or the other, which one would you pick? But we happen to be in a world where there seems to be, at least today, enough money around the system that we can, walk and chew gum at the same time and, do both care innovation as well as, drug discovery, at least for now. Both seem like robust markets.
Brian, I see you have a question. We only have 5 more minutes, so maybe one after Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
I just wanted to add on to that. I think that they're not both. I think they're both kind of similar tasks. I think the more that we're kind of learning from the experiences of patients and getting that learning back out, is what was commented earlier. I mean, obviously, the most expensive part about drug development is the clinical evidence generation, and so having these systems that are able to kind of collect data and analyze in an efficient way makes that process much more affordable, and you can unlock a lot of innovation, but it also is the same system that you get those learnings back out to patients.
Yeah, change care. All right, well, thank you everybody for the time today, and